Representing the Board of Directors of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston, it's my pleasure to present Kevin Pasha. Kevin Pasha is a board member of the World Affairs Council, a vice president at JP Morgan. He advises families and institutional clients on matters related to investment and portfolio management. Kevin was a Marshall Memorial Fellow representing the US and the EU and Eastern Europe in 2013. With a focus on green technology, NATO expansion and banking, and financial stability, he has a bachelor's degree from Baylor University and a master's degree from Harvard University. Please help me welcome Kevin Pasha. Thank you.
Thank you, Felecia. Thank you, everybody, for joining us here today on behalf of the board of the World Affairs Council. I welcome everyone viewing and listening into this, what I think will be a highly informative and entertaining webinar, certainly on a country that was built out of the crucible of what was British decolonization, in this case, Pakistan. And speaking on this topic is a famed author and a man of many various backgrounds, Shuja Nawaz. Shuja is a political and strategic analyst. He is a distinguished fellow at the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C. He writes for leading newspapers and the Huffington Post and speaks on current topics before civics groups, at think tanks, and on radio and on television, I guess now in YouTube and Zoom. He has worked on projects with RAND, the United States Institute of Peace, the Center for Strategic International Studies, the Atlantic Council, and other leading think tanks on projects dealing with Pakistan and the Middle East. In January 2009, he was made the first director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States. He has worked for the New York Times, the World Health Organization, and has headed 3 separate divisions at the International Monetary Fund. He was also a director at the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna from 1999 to 2001, while on leave from the IMF. Mr. Nawaz was the managing editor and then editor of Finance and Development, the multilingual quarterly of the IMF and the World Bank. He served on the editorial advisory board of the World Bank Research Observer. Mr. Nawaz was educated at Gordon College, Rawalpindi, where he obtained a BA in economics and English literature, and the Graduate School of Journalism of Columbia University in New York, where he was a Cabot Fellow and won the Henry Taylor International Correspondent Award. Please join me in welcoming our speaker today, Shuja Nawaz. Shuja?
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Ronan, and the Houston World Affairs Council for inviting me.
Thank you so much, Shuja, and thank you, Kevin, for a great introduction, and Felecia as well for an excellent introduction and all the wonderful work you do with our high school and college students. And Shuja, I just want to thank you so much. We've been looking to host Shuja now for almost a year with everything with COVID. It's been a bit hectic and disjointed, but I just wanted to say this is an incredible book for anyone who is interested in not just Pakistan, but especially the roles and the ties between Pakistan and the United States. I think there is no more definitive book. Shuja is very modest. He won't talk about it, but I don't know if there's anybody who has deeper connections to both the highest levels of foreign policy, intelligence, and the military for both Pakistan and the United States. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that obviously you have a deep appreciation and I think really affinity and love for both countries. And also, just in case you're wondering, I have the South Asian version of the book, the one behind Shuja's shoulder, and you'll find a link for it on our website and on the notes here for the chat. That's the North American version of it. But Shuja, I just want to thank you so much for coming. And your book largely focuses upon the last 20 years or so of the US-Pakistani relationship. For people who want to know more, a deeper understanding of the Pakistani military in particular, its roles, how it's developed, obviously the challenges regarding to India. Your acclaimed book, Crossed Swords, is another book I'd recommend. But could you just briefly, because I want to get to the book really of the last 20 years, and especially 2011 when things kind of went so wrong, could you talk about how it is that a lot of Americans, one thing they always ask is why and how is it that the military became such a commanding presence in so many aspects, the military and really the intelligence services of ISI in particular in Pakistan, really since the time of partition until through today?
Thank you, Ronan. That was a very nice summary of the issues and some of the things that I've tried to cover in my earlier book and also in the new one. Pakistan, as you know, came into being in 1947, the night before India became independent. So both of them essentially, technically, were born on the 15th of August, but Pakistan celebrates its Independence Day on the 14th of August, and that was in 1947. Immediately after independence, both countries got embroiled in a war which has never ended over the princely state of Kashmir, which was a large majority Muslim state with a Hindu ruler. And so there's a question as to whether he would accede to Pakistan because of his population, or whether he would accede to India because of his religion and because of the machinations that were going on in Delhi at the time under the Governor General, Lord Mountbatten. And so as a result, right after the country was born and before it had stood on its feet, Pakistan was embroiled in a conflict in Kashmir, which became complicated because a group of tribal raiders entered the fray on the Pakistani side, hoping to persuade the Maharaja of Kashmir, and so to join Pakistan. And that didn't happen. And as a result, Kashmir became bifurcated into what's known, depending on which side of the border you're sitting on, as Indian-occupied Kashmir and Pakistan-occupied Kashmir. So the Pakistanis refer to it as Azad Jammu and Kashmir, which is free Jammu and Kashmir, and India refers to it as Jammu and Kashmir. So that area has been the reason for a number of conflicts and many conflicts between India and Pakistan. And that is essentially the answer to your question. It thrust the military, which was the only organized and disciplined force in the country at that time, into the middle of decision making. And they were some officers in the military who were disappointed with the civilians for not having allowed them full reign and not having allowed them to enter the war early. And they thought as a result, they lost the key element of Kashmir, which was the valley of Srinagar. And as a result, the army gradually started asserting itself. And as the political system failed to take root and democracy failed to take root, the military filled the vacuum. That entered the United States, which was always a favored ally of Pakistan, now that it had broken with the British rule. And the United States needed allies to form a bulwark against Soviet aggression. Particularly, their fear was that the Soviets would go through Iran to the oil fields of Iraq and Iran and to the Gulf and establish a strong presence there. And so the United States had formed an alliance with Turkey, and Turkey and Pakistan had very close relations. And so the Turks essentially coached Pakistan in how to get on the right side of the Americans. And they prepared themselves in such a way as to offer a deal to the United States, which the US couldn't refuse, which was that Pakistan would join with Turkey and protect this southern flank of the Soviet Union in a manner that they couldn't enter Iran or Iraq. This was the US military pact, which then led to a coalition that the United States supported called the Baghdad Pact, which was then succeeded by a subsequent group called the Central Treaty Organization. And that is now a kind of precursor of CENTCOM, which is the US command, which is based in Florida as well as in the Persian Gulf. So this relationship goes back to the early 50s. The US trained Pakistan's military, it equipped it, and knowing fully well that Pakistan still saw India, the looming large behemoth to its eastern border, as the constant threat on the existence of Pakistan. And they were moving a lot of the new troops that were raised and the equipment to the eastern border. The US willingly accepted that with the promise that when the need arose, the Pakistanis and the Turks would protect the free world from the Soviet Union. Well, the Soviet Union never broke that boundary except in 1979 when they entered Afghanistan. And the Pakistanis got support from the Saudis. The Saudis assisted them in laying host to what turned out to be called the Mujahideen, the freedom fighters, the Islamic freedom fighters that came from Afghanistan. And then the United States entered the fray under President Carter and under National Security Advisor Zbig Brzezinski. And that war was won by this group that was trained and housed and harbored in Pakistan. But the legacy of that war is persisting to this day and eventually led to the Taliban, the creation of an Islamic militant force inside Afghanistan that then housed Al-Qaeda, which led to the 2001 9/11 attacks on the United States. That's a kind of a potted history of that early period and how the Pakistan military became very critically conjoined with the US military and foreign policy in the region.
Yeah, that was an excellent summary. Could easily be an entire major or entire course in college. Thank you for summarizing it so quickly. And I suppose, also for a lot of Americans to understand, despite what they might think, India being the world's largest democracy for so many years, for much of the time since its independence, because of its desire for the non-alliance movement, it was not necessarily a strong ally of the United States, and in a lot of ways had stronger connection with the Soviet Union, buying large amounts of Soviet weaponry. But maybe we could just now turn to what you were kind of prefacing. Obviously, United States had a military alliance with Pakistan since the 50s, but the removal of the Soviet Union in the 1980s, especially under Reagan, was the first time that the two fought directly, even if it was covertly with CIA and other special forces going in together, but both supporting Mujahideen, both supporting Islamist movements and insurgencies. By the time we get to 2001, the 9/11, the Taliban is only recognized officially by 3 countries. Saudi Arabia, one of its biggest financial benefactors, the United Arab Emirates, and Pakistan. Can you talk about how quickly and decisively, I suppose, things changed or hopefully would change between the US and Pakistan relationship from 9/11, especially with regards to the invasion of Afghanistan, and perhaps maybe how for the first few years they were initially on the same page, but obviously things drifted apart as long-term goals perhaps did not coincide with each other.
Well, there was a sense of deja vu, and this is a constant theme in Pakistani politics as well as in the US-Pakistan relationship. There's always a feeling that you've seen this movie before. So when the Soviets invaded, Pakistan was being ruled by a military dictator named General Zia-ul-Haq, and he had been ostracized. He was a pariah. The United States had broken off ties with him and didn't want to have much to do with him. But suddenly he became useful. And so he became the best friend of the United States, and particularly of President Reagan, because he was ready to fight the fight against the Soviets. And he was an Islamist at heart himself. And so it was easy for him to join this so-called jihad against the Soviets in Afghanistan. Well, in 1999, the army chief who had been removed by the then Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, while he was flying back from a trip to Sri Lanka, had a coup launched by his officers in his name, which brought him into power, and he took over as the chief executive of Pakistan, and his name was General Pervez Musharraf. He eventually declared himself to be the president, got himself elected through a referendum also, and tried to legitimize his position. But he was ostracized. He was ostracized to the effect that even when President Clinton stopped in Pakistan briefly after a trip to India, he didn't want any photographs taken with the general. And he made a very quick in and out trip out of Islamabad and flew straight out without even spending a night. The only thing he did was connect with the people of Pakistan through a television address. So this was the situation when suddenly 9/11 occurred. The United States came to a decision that because the Taliban government had been housing the Al-Qaeda leadership and Osama bin Laden, and had refused to hand him over despite various entreaties, including by the Pakistanis and the Pakistani head of the intelligence agency, General Mahmoud Ahmed. They decided that they would teach Afghanistan a lesson and go into Afghanistan, get rid of Al-Qaeda, and remove their possibility of ever having a base in that country. This was the story behind the 2001 October invasion. Now, in my new book, in chapter 4, I actually have a flashback to that period, because the story that America has known was that the CIA sent in 6 teams, and they were called Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, and Foxtrot, and from the north to the south, they were there to foment a rebellion by nationalist Afghan forces against Al-Qaeda and against the Taliban. And they were to be the spearhead of the US effort to enter Afghanistan. What many people, even in America, did not know was that there was an officer named Brigadier General James Mattis, who had done very well in the first Gulf War, in the invasion of Kuwait, when they ousted Saddam Hussein from Kuwait as a lieutenant colonel, and had done very well in Iraq and had been made a brigadier general. He was a Marine, and he was the first Marine to be named as the head of a naval task force called TF-58. And he was tasked to go with troops into Afghanistan, establish a base near Kandahar, which was the center of gravity of the Taliban, and to use military muscle to get rid of them and liaise with the CIA teams. And his first stop was Pakistan. And so this was the rehabilitation of a dictator who had been ostracized by the US again. And overnight, he was now America's best friend. He was President George W. Bush's best friend, and a frequent visitor later at the White House. And Pervez Musharraf immediately did a 180 degree, cut off ties with the Taliban in public, and then joined the US alliance. And Jim Mattis worked out a deal with the Joint Chiefs of Staff headquarters to land his Marines at a base at a place called Pasni on the Gulf coast of Pakistan, from where they were taken overnight to Jacobabad, an airfield in the middle of the country. And from there, they flew to what became known as Objective Rhino, that later became Camp Rhino, the largest US camp in Afghanistan to date. So that was the beginning. And the relationship, as I said, was deja vu all over again, in the words of Yogi Berra, because you had a dictator who was now suddenly best friends. And the United States was now ready, willing and able to give Pakistan, on average, about $1 billion+ of direct as well as covert assistance during this period.
And the book, does an incredible job of explaining it and highlighting, especially kind of more recent years, and probably the most seminal year, 2011. But as you note in the book, some things were kind of under the radar, but other things were right out there in public. Someone like Admiral Mullen, leading the U.S. efforts, was very clear at points saying, what he felt the U.S. concerns were about Pakistan. And you mentioned, General Kayani giving a very clear and straightforward memo regarding the Pakistani concerns, and each of them really having growing mistrust of each other, despite this major, codependence of each other. That can you explain how and why it is that it I suppose over the years really devolved into such a transactional relationship and got to a point, especially by 2011, besides the killing of Osama bin Laden, but the killing of 24 Pakistani troops at Salalah, why it is that the relationship deteriorated so far?
Ronan, I think it all comes down to basically one issue, which is that this was a marriage between unequal partners. And the English word for that has been taken straight from the French, and it's misalliance. And when I began working on this book, my working title for the book was Misalliance. But my editor at Rowman and Littlefield thought that it's a little too highfalutin. And so it would be better to give a more descriptive title. So we called it The Battle for Pakistan and the Bitter US Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood, because we wanted to capture all that. But essentially, it was an unequal partnership. And as a result, there was resentment and mistrust on both sides. The Pakistanis knew that at some point the United States would pack up and leave, which they had done before in Afghanistan after the Soviet jihad. And so they hedged their bets by retaining some kind of conversational links and ties with the Afghan Taliban, whom ostensibly they were fighting against and whom they were preventing from using their territory as a base, but not very successfully. So they had ceded space to the Taliban in the border region of Pakistan with Afghanistan. And the US knew that, and as a result, the drone warfare started. And it accelerated, particularly under President Obama. And so you had this very bizarre relationship between allies, where one ally was at will infringing the sovereignty of the other by working with their military and with their government in attacking targets inside their territory. And the government of Pakistan and the Pakistan military was keeping this from the people of Pakistan. And they would publicly protest the US infringement, but privately, and thanks to WikiLeaks and thanks to my own interviews with leading people in the US as well as in Britain, Germany, and in Pakistan, I can now say that they were fully aware of what was going on, and they participated in many of the targeting decisions that were being made inside Pakistani territory. And so there was this very bizarre situation. But at the local level, because the Taliban were using Pakistan as a base and killing American and coalition forces inside Afghanistan, there was a great deal of resentment on the part of troops and their commanders inside Afghanistan. Troops from the coalition forces and particularly the Americans. And so I could feel that palpable hatred and mistrust for their Pakistani counterparts. And because there wasn't a direct, frequent communication and conversations across the border with their counterparts, this mistrust showed itself in a number of incidents. And you mentioned Salalah, which is a well-known pass and a well-known height in the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which was attacked by US forces with flags flying. The Pakistanis were on the peak in uniform, regular forces, and a large number of them were killed. This was just one of the many issues that erupted in 2011. The most serious one, of course, was the attack on Abbottabad, the raid that led to the killing of Osama bin Laden, because that involved the penetration of Pakistani territory. It wasn't just the border region. And the execution of a terrorist on Pakistani soil and then taking his body back to Afghanistan, making the Pakistanis appear either complicit or incompetent. And they took the incompetence plea in order to safeguard themselves from their own people. And then, of course, we had an incident involving a CIA operative in Lahore who killed 2 people in broad daylight because he thought that they were probably agents of the local intelligence service. It just got completely out of hand. And so 2011 represented the worst that could happen. And then on top of it was an issue called Memogate, where the Pakistani ambassador to Washington, Hussein Haqqani, was accused of being the principal author of a letter that was drafted by Mansoor Ijaz, a Pakistani American, that was apparently delivered to Admiral Mullen and to Jim Jones, who was then National Security Advisor, which said essentially that if the US helps us, we will change the military and the intelligence leadership and make them much more compliant and pro-United States. And of course, that was never fully resolved. But as you said, I was very lucky in being at the right place at the right time and having worked with almost all the key players, starting with Admiral Mullen on the US side and going down to the CENTCOM commanders, including Dave Petraeus and Jim Mattis and others, and Stan McChrystal, as well as the Pakistani military hierarchy and the civil hierarchy. So I managed to get on the record interviews with people that helped me stitch together this story. Even though it may not have a definitive end as yet, it will help people understand the machinations and the multi-layered intrigue that occurred in this relationship.
And thank you for addressing obviously something that a lot of Americans hear about, obviously, for better or for worse, and we'll talk about it later. How in some ways there has been blowback of Pakistani at least support or connections to Taliban groups, Haqqani network. We'll discuss that here in a little bit. But maybe the other big concern that you hear from the Pakistani side, but also from the U.S. side, is the issue of nuclear weapons. As you note throughout the book, most of the most senior American military foreign policy leaders have tried to assure Pakistan, we are not trying to remove your nuclear capabilities. At this stage, I think the U.S. is willing to accept both a nuclear India and a nuclear Pakistan. But from the Pakistani side, they feel that is another objective. Do you think that's something that needs to be clarified more? And I suppose both sides need to understand where they stand on it.
I think so. And I think it'll happen particularly once there is an orderly withdrawal from Afghanistan, which is probably likely to be slightly delayed under the new Biden administration, because I suspect that they don't want a precipitate withdrawal, because they've dealt with the results of precipitate withdrawals. You create a vacuum, and then normally the forces of terrorism and evil take over within the country, and you end up sacrificing your allies whom you've propped up over the years. So I suspect that President Biden and Tony Blinken and their teams will come up with a solution which will keep the United States reasonably engaged. And the critical deadline is going to be this coming May. So decisions will have to be made very quickly and conveyed much in advance of the May deadline to people in the field, as well as to allies, particularly in NATO, so that they are ready to either leave or to stay on and continue supporting the US mission. My knowledge and experience of working with the NATO leadership, as well as with British leadership, is that they will probably go along with a reasonable US presence inside Afghanistan, and think much more in terms of a longer-term economic engagement with the country, so that you don't pull the rug from under the feet of the Afghans, who have tied themselves to the United States and to the West for many years, and who will be the subject of brutal attacks and vicious reprisals by the Taliban if they take over Kabul. So I think that's going to happen. The same will likely occur in Iraq, where there was a sudden withdrawal, which led to the emergence of ISIS, and we saw the results of that. But the US, I think, did the right thing in supporting the Kurds and other groups that were ready to take the battle to ISIS. And ISIS made the mistake of trying to set up a permanent conventional government, which allowed them to be attacked and replaced. But there are these issues that are still brewing, and I think we now have a team that wants to join the world and to take on partnerships, particularly with Australia, with Japan, with Korea, and the Europeans, and countries in the region, and take a more regional approach. Having worked with them in the past, and having twice briefed Vice President Biden on these issues personally, I know that he is much more informed and engaged with these issues than President Trump was.
All right, thank you. And I think just to move, if 2011 was a low point, 2013 is perhaps a hopeful point. The first time in Pakistani history that you have a transfer of power from one civilian government to another. And then perhaps also more recently with the election of Imran Khan, the first time we have a prime minister or a civil leader who's not from one of the family dynasties. Can you maybe talk about what you see as the next 5-10 years of governance in Pakistan? And I suppose also just the civil governments, as you note in the book, despite the fact that the U.S. has always had its strongest and most consistent relationships with the military, maybe because they realize they're the guiding hand so often. You also note that the civil governments realize they need a strong relationship with the United States, if nothing else, because some of them feel it's a cushion or I suppose a prevention of another military coup.
Yes, they see the US as an insurance, but my problem with that approach is this. I think if you're elected to govern, then you should govern to the best of your ability in the interest of your country and not sell your country short and not sell it cheaply to the United States or to anyone else, China or the Russians or the Indians or whoever. Pakistan's dynastic families have more often than not taken very short-term measures, and more often than not have not looked over the horizon to see what needs to be done in Pakistan to take advantage of its inherent strategic location, as well as the fact that it has a youthful population. 60% of the country is below 30. And if they could only educate and give them a healthy life, this is a huge dividend for Pakistan, which they have not been able to cash in. They talk about it, but they don't do anything about it. And so the military remains the only disciplined and organized group within the country. You rightly said Imran Khan came in as a dissident of sorts. He came in as an insurgent who basically got the youth of the country together, particularly the large growing urban population of the country, and spoke to their aspirations. But he chose street power, and he doesn't have a family that is involved in business, but he had to rely on the power brokers that existed there. And so he has a party that he's finding very difficult to keep together because it's fractured and constantly at war with itself. And it's a party of turncoats who've come from other political parties, sometimes at the instigation of the intelligence agencies who thought that, if they could run as independents and win their elections and then join the government, that, they would have a more stable government. The critical thing, and this is no news to you or me or to anyone else today, is this, that the pandemic has now created an economic hole for countries like Pakistan and the United States. And so even in the US, Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, talked about the fact that the US is not going to come out of the economic hole till 2024. Now for Pakistan, that is not going to happen till 2030. And that's a long time, by which time it will have lost jobs, it will have a larger quantum of youth that will be out looking for jobs and will be available to be taken over by any populist forces, whether right-wing or left-wing, and more likely right-wing. And then the same thing is happening in India, where they are losing jobs, and the growth rate has been tumbling from the 8 or 9 or 10% aspirational rates to closer to 3 and below. In Pakistan last year, it was 0.04% growth rate. And this year, if they're lucky, they will hit 2%. So they are losing jobs when they should be adding 1 million new jobs a year. India is losing jobs when they should be adding 12 to 15 million jobs a year. And India's growth has dropped something like 10 points in this period. And so what is happening on the ground is governance is going to be the challenge. Governance against an economic and medical challenge, a health challenge, that will demand that resources be created and targeted to help the people to recover. But they've also unleashed the forces on the right. So India has gone extreme right, and it is now seen as largely a Hindu-dominated government, creating problems inside the country, but also with neighbors like Pakistan. And that will provoke a right-wing move inside Pakistan, which will be difficult even for the military to control, because the military is now recruited heavily from the cities. And the petty bourgeoisie in the cities tend to be more conservative in religious terms, not radical, but likely to become radical if the situation deteriorates and goes out of control. So there's a cauldron of right-wing tendencies that is brewing in South Asia, which I worry about. And I think it's very critical for the governments in the region, and it's very critical for us in America and in the West if we want to retain stability in that region, particularly with two nuclear-armed powers, that we help them get out of this morass, but not make them dependent on aid, make them responsible for aid. Have a results-based aid program. Have them set the targets, and if they don't meet them, then the aid stops. We've been far too lax, and I have a number of chapters in my book talking about both military and civil aid on how poorly thought through they were, how they lacked a vision about what they wanted to achieve. And this was a conversation I had with the then vice president in the White House over lunch. And he liked the idea of making people responsible for the aid you give them. And he really celebrated that approach. But it couldn't be done because there wasn't enough partnership on the ground.
Thank you for a great explanation of that. Another aspect that you've called out here, and for years you've been, I suppose, one of the stronger, more prominent voices noting it from a Pakistani perspective. You note that besides the kind of whatever you want to call it, but tacit approval or connections with the Taliban or Haqqani network and others, there is also a growing Islamist influence, at least to some degree, within the military and some of the intelligence services. You note in the book, this isn't like the 1970s or 60s or 80s where the officers would be in kind of a British officers club sipping scotch. Now, it still might not be a large number of them, but there are going to be some officers who have more of an Islamist background or influence. And also, you mentioned that the real threat of those who retired, especially intelligence services, who may be retired and then end up under the wings of Islamist groups. Can you talk about, you mentioned the book, there are two major military threats to Pakistan now. There's the ongoing concerns about India, but the growing and perhaps in some ways more difficult internal threat of Islamist movements.
Well, as you know, organizations find it hard to look inside themselves, particularly when they're disciplined, organized groups like the military. We've seen it in the United States. In the last week or 10 days in Washington, there's been a lot of introspection. And even up to 2 or 3 days ago, where there were reports of X number of National Guardsmen being removed from duty because of what they had been saying or doing on social media. And it's the same thing in Pakistan. You have recruitment, which is now largely urban, largely middle class and lower middle class, not from traditional rural background, not from traditional military backgrounds. So in many ways, it's truly representative of the people of Pakistan, and which is a good thing always. But at the same time, the influences that are affecting other people, and particularly the youth in the cities and in the petty bourgeoisie of the cities, are also going to affect the officers and the soldiers that are being recruited from those areas. Now, in my earlier book, I reported on a study I'd done with Christine Fair, in which we had mapped out all the recruitment of the Pakistan military and the changes in it. And it had shifted from the north, which was the traditional Punjabi area, to central and south Punjab, and even the cities. And so in the decade ending 2003, if memory serves me right, there were more officers recruited from Karachi, which is a metropolis of 20 to 25 million people in the south, than from my hometown, Jhelum, which is a traditional military recruiting base for centuries. My own family has done nothing but join the military. I am literally the first in my family not to have joined the military, and I almost did. My brother, who became the army chief later, said to me, "You like to read and write, so why don't you do what you like to do?" And so he put me on this path. But there's this change that has occurred, and it's very tough for the military to look inside and to be able to examine itself, because if there are weaknesses, they don't want these weaknesses to become apparent or to become public. And that in itself is a weakness. So I think it's very critical that there be a recognition that the forces of change are there. You make people responsible, you give them respect, you allow their views to emerge, and then they will not be radicalized. So there needs to be a different approach to de-radicalization, and there needs to be much more investment in education than currently there is.
And getting back to the US-Pakistani relationship, as you note so well and clearly in the book, besides at times often being very transactional, they both have kind of long-term different goals. Obviously, if the United States sees India as a growing power and especially a bulwark against China, it's perhaps going to put more influence into its relationship with India. But when we look at Afghanistan, can you talk about, I suppose, you mentioned earlier that after what happened with the Soviets, fighting the Soviets, the United States left. The Pakistanis felt they needed to keep connections with Taliban, or at least power brokers within Afghanistan. Why it is that Pakistan is so crucial for any realistic peace deal in Pakistan, and maybe what is the realistic Pakistani expectations for a peace deal in Pakistan, and how that might be different from what the United States would consider, and even different again from the Afghan government, which in some ways ironically feels left out of a peace deal when the US and Pakistan might be talking with the Taliban, but the Afghani government's not involved.
Well, if you recall, the US also excluded the Afghan national government from the Doha talks till they'd reached some kind of a tentative framework for the peace deal with the Taliban. And President Ghani, who is somebody I've known over the years, I would venture to call him a friend, has taken great umbrage at that. I believe even currently the situation between him and his old friend and university mate from the University of Beirut, American University of Beirut, Zalmay Khalilzad, it's a very cold relationship at the moment because he feels that Ambassador Khalilzad, in his haste to get a deal going, has sold the Afghan government short. Let me see if I can give you in a thumbnail sketch what I see as one of the key issues. Afghanistan is a much older country than Pakistan. It is a country that has been in existence for much longer, but it has a system of governance which was based on what they call misake-milli, a concord of the people, where people got together from different parts of the country, different ethnic groups, different sectarian groups, and they agreed to live and let live and to establish a central government and a ruler in Kabul who was more a titular ruler than a real strong central ruler. And the king served that purpose as being a kind of political glue for Afghanistan. When the king went away, they even tried to bring him back at one time after the war against the Soviets, but he didn't want to. And so when the US went in, it produced its own model and imposed it in Bonn on the Afghans by putting a strong central ruler in the form of Hamid Karzai, so that almost every decision that had to be made in the country was being made in Kabul out of the presidential palace. If you wanted to post a teacher somewhere, you had to get somebody in the palace to call and approve it. And so as a result, it kind of destroyed the fabric that held the country together. And the Taliban took advantage of that. Governance fell, and so the Taliban would come into the countryside and provide governance. And they had shadow government going around all the provinces, and still do, outside the main cities. And so that has created a problem. I think what Pakistan would like to see is a much more stabler situation and an agreement by all the Afghan parties so that there is, in fact, not a radical government in Kabul. Because if there's a radical Islamic government in Kabul, they're going to turn their eyes on Pakistan. And they're going to turn their eyes on their fellow Pakhtuns, especially in Pakistan, and say to them, join us. You belong to an Islamic emirate and not to the so-called Islamic Republic of Pakistan. And that'll be a problem. There's a quote from General Kiani, the army chief, when he was talking to a visitor from the United States, which I mention in the book. He said, if Kabul falls to the Taliban, it'll be very bad for Afghanistan, it'll be worse for Pakistan. I think that is behind the thinking in Pakistan now, and the military and the civil are desperately trying to make sure that the Afghans can be encouraged to reach some kind of a concord again, and to form a government which will work with neighbors. And in that quest, I think the US can play a major role, particularly under the Biden administration, as they reopen a dialogue with Iran on the nuclear issue. They can reopen a dialogue with Iran on Afghanistan, because Iran played a big role in the 2001 period when they helped settle the western part of Afghanistan down. They can do that again. They can create economic opportunities for Afghanistan, and they can provide the linkages that even China needs to go in and out of Afghanistan. And from my side, I think the Pakistanis need to accelerate the western corridor of the China-Pakistan economic corridor, so that it goes through Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and Balochistan to the Gulf. And that can provide an access for a tributary from Afghanistan. Then you can also have the link between Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India over time, as well as the link between Iran, Pakistan, and India over time, which is the two pipelines that can knit the region together. If the US can take a more regional approach, taking advantage of its relationship with Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, then it won't be seen as taking sides. It can be a facilitator, and it can bring the Western alliance into this process. The Asian Development Bank has already done the groundwork for the TAPI pipeline, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. That needs to become a reality. Similarly, the import of electricity from Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan through Afghanistan into Pakistan and then into India, because India will need every ounce of energy that it can get. And it can't rely simply on oil. It has to rely on cheap electricity coming overland. There can be much more that will make India and Pakistan codependent and make Afghanistan, India, and Pakistan codependent, in my humble view.
That's great. Not no, obviously no need to be humble. I just want to turn to some audience questions now. Sarah asks, at least superficially, former President Trump and Prime Minister Modi seem to have a close relationship. Has that damaged the US-Pakistani relationship?
Yes and no. I think the Pakistanis always were suspicious of that relationship. But with the departure of President Trump, I think a more normal relationship will occur between India and India and the United States. And it's a very necessary relationship. But it will not be informed, as the Trump policy was, by an enmity of China. It will be seen much more as competition with China, to be able to balance China's growing influence in the economic sphere, particularly in the Indo-Pacific. Now, India has very specific aims in the Indo-Pacific, and they don't necessarily accord with the United States, and we have to recognize that. India doesn't want to be the unwilling sidekick to the United States. India wants to be seen as a partner. But India also offers the United States an enormous market. But for that, India needs to recover its economy. India also is the first or the second largest importer of arms in the world today, which is a big attraction for the US defense industry and the European defense industry. But as you said in your introduction, the old Soviet and the Russian links remain. So the Indian Air Force is predominantly still heavily dependent on Russia, whether it is co-production of equipment and aircraft, or whether it is the reliance on a Russian anti-ballistic missile system, which the US has been advising India against. These are issues that India will face. And so Pakistan needs to have its own separate relationship, and Pakistan needs to look to trade and its strategic location for trade, not for military purposes, nor to seek strategic rents from its friends in the West, which it has been doing and which has been very short-sighted, which is what my historical review informs me.
All right, no, great. Kind of something you discussed in the book, especially that the floods in, I think, 2010. But a soft power question. Walter asked, Karachi has suffered recently from a natural disaster. What can the U.S. and U.S. nonprofits do to provide aid, and can that help improve the U.S.-Pakistani relationship?
I discussed the aid issue, as I said, both military and civil aid. And one of the lessons that I come up with is this. When the US goes in to help any country, and particularly Pakistan, and I use the Pakistan example because I cover it in detail in the book, when it goes in for pure altruistic reasons, because it is the right thing to do, whether it's floods, whether it's earthquake relief, whether it's COVID, whatever, it is greeted warmly and people think of it as a friend. When the US helps build infrastructure that help create hospitals or universities, things that last, or dams that provide electricity to a country, people point to that and say the Americans built that. Even the nuclear reactor that the US gave Pakistan, which led to its people being trained in nuclear sciences for civilian purposes, is still one of the proudest buildings that Pakistanis will point out to you when you go to Islamabad. But when there is a short-sighted approach to aid for direct foreign policy quid pro quo, or for security reasons for the short run, keeping in mind domestic needs and elections every 2 years or every 4 years in the US, people are not willing to accept that as aid. They see that as a payment, as creation of a mercenary force. So even the Pakistan military, many people within the military saw themselves being looked at as mercenaries, fighting an American war. Imran Khan used to talk about that when he was in the opposition. He would accuse the military of fighting for the Americans. So I think there's a big difference in how you come up with aid. And going back to the basic issue that I believe in, having spent 30 years in the IMF and the World Bank, working with countries around the world, and particularly looking at Pakistan, when you make people responsible for their aid and accountable and make it transparent, then the aid will not go into corrupt hands and pockets. And people will know and will allow you to label it as American aid. I had great difficulty in FATA, where I saw some very good projects that our group from the Department of State had set up for helping people, that were not being labeled as American projects because their local partners would say to them, oh, this will attract the attention of the Taliban and they will attack and destroy these schools or these hospitals or pharmacies. I don't believe that. I think the people will defend them. And they were prepared to defend them. And we just completely misread it. And we wasted something of the order of $34 billion of transfers of aid and direct assistance and coalition support funds to Pakistan from 2002 till now.
Wow. And just for the sake of time, we'll just basically get two more audience questions. If you can try and be a little bit brief with them. Nashad asks, do you expect Saudi pressure for Pakistan to recognize and establish diplomatic relations with Israel?
I'm sure that there will be discussions on that, and Pakistan should act in its own interest. Pakistan does not have a direct war with Israel, and there's no reason for Pakistan not to have a relationship with Israel. After all, the country that Pakistan fears the most is in its own neighborhood, that's India. And Pakistan has always had diplomatic relations with India, even when they went to war. So having a diplomatic relationship doesn't mean that you will stop supporting the things that you are supporting, such as the rights of the Palestinians, and that the Muslim world can and should be doing. Moreover, there have been many behind-the-scenes direct links between Pakistan and Israel through South Africa that people have talked about. And the Israelis know it, the Pakistanis know it, so why not let the world know that you can talk to them?
All right, great. And another question that could be an entire webinar or semester course. TD asks, do you think this Hindu-centric government in India, how real is the threat, or how real is the perceived threat that India might start a war with Pakistan over the Kashmiri issue?
I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not very fond of making predictions, but I look at scenarios. And I've been working on many scenarios for the U.S. government over the years, and in scenarios you have to look at what the possibilities and the probabilities are, and what are the key factors. There may be some conventional limited conflicts or engagements on the borders under a nuclear overhang, but the nuclear overhang and the presence of so-called tactical weapons in the hands of Pakistan in particular, and Pakistan's avowed aim of using them even on its own soil as a kind of poison pill defense for any Indian incursion into Pakistani territory, would give India second thoughts. Moreover, once the nuclear triggers are pushed, something of the order of 17 cities in India and Pakistan will be going up in dust, and you'll have nuclear winter in the Northern Hemisphere. So the whole world needs to be aware of this, not just India and Pakistan.
Yeah, well, thank you. Obviously, a dire but necessary issue for people to think about and talk about. But maybe just in summary, in conclusion, related to your book, again, The Battle for Pakistan. Shuja's got the American version behind him. Please, buy this excellent book if you want to learn more about the U.S. relationship with Pakistan, and more importantly, I think, get a better understanding of the Pakistani perspective for the last 20 years, especially. There's a link to it at the bottom of our page, and someone also asked about a video of this event. We will have it on YouTube, so it'll be on our YouTube channel probably by tomorrow afternoon. But lastly, Shuja, you mentioned some of what you hope for with the new administration going forward. What do you hope for and kind of expect for that you have mentioned already for the U.S.-Pakistani relationship kind of the next 2, 3, 5 years?
I think this first year will be one of a shuffle step where we'll get back in line with each other. There will be a number of things that the US government will do rapidly, particularly on Afghanistan and on Iraq, which will affect the Middle East and the area that Pakistan is in. I think the dampening down of the tensions with China will take the pressure off Pakistan regarding the China-Pakistan economic corridor. I think we have to give them some breathing room. They're also facing a deadline with the Financial Action Task Force, which has been operating, which has given Pakistan till February to sort out a number of lacuna in its financial regulations to control terrorist financing. Pakistan has met most of the targets, but there are still a handful that have not yet been handled. And I think it is in Pakistan's own interest to get those done quickly so that Pakistan doesn't get ostracized and removed from the international financial system. What happens around the region will affect the country and the US relationship. So the Iran relationship, the sooner it can get back on track, will allow Pakistan and India and Iran to be able to have normal trading relationships. And the biggest thing that the US can do for Pakistan eventually is to allow more trade under lighter duties, maybe even up to the European levels, so that Pakistan can perhaps maybe even eat into the Chinese export of textiles into the United States and move up the value chain and help themselves rather than rely on US assistance. And finally, I think the US has an important role through the multilateral organizations, such as the IMF, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and also from the Islamic Development Bank, to give Pakistan its much needed assistance which would give it the time to make reforms internally.
Again, I want to thank Shuja Nawaz so much for this excellent talk, wonderful book, and I think more importantly for a large part of your career, being such an advocate for both the United States and for Pakistan, two countries that you both love and have families obviously in both places, and for many years of being an incredible advisor and really I think advocate and nexus between the two at our highest levels. So thank you very much for all you've done, and we look forward to hosting you again at some point down the line. And thank you all to the audience for joining us, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you all again next week. Thank you very much.